starting out at a planning committee this year. This is Andrew Leo's third lecture. So I'm going to be you already know that he's currently in theology, pastoral theology, but I just want to know the tradition to a long-term committed congregational ministry, and has also served the wider church. He's currently a member of the Theology committee, and that is it was through that committee I first met him, and he has always impressed me as somebody who is well-read and deeply connected to the church and pulls all of those things together. I say that because in the first two lectures, he's already given us evidence of that. And so, Andy, welcome. We look forward to your third address this morning.
Good morning. There's a lot there. Would you pray with me, please? Wherefore, seeing we are encompassed about by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us set aside every weight and the sin that so easily besets us, and run with patience the race that is set before us, looking always unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Amen. When I would help my grandmother, who lived in Cape Breton, clean up after a long day of family events, she would say, "Oh, thank you, dear, you're a saint." Watching someone that I care about put up with ignorance and indifference, I might say, I don't know how she does it. She is a saint. And when my wife nursed our two children through throwing up on a plane for 3 hours, and then nursed me through the same and worse 2 days later, I said to her, "Oh, honey, you're a saint." Now, in the United Church, we're not very familiar with the process of canonization, or how a person becomes recognized. Sorry, Alan, I'm getting a lot of ringing feedback. Would you mind just seeing what that is, please? Try it now. Test. Great. Thank you so much. Most of us in the United Church are not familiar with the process of canonization, or how a person is recognized by the church as a saint. Though I have visited 2 of the 3 sites that claim to be where St. Patrick is buried. About 5 years ago, though, the sainthood of a very famous figure in the church was made official and garnered a lot of attention, and that was the sainthood of Mother Teresa. The process of becoming a saint is not usually a swift one. It can take years for a person's good works to be evaluated, and decades for them to be beatified on the path to sainthood, centuries before they're canonized. However, there are 2 reasons why Mother Teresa's canonization was so swift. The first is that in today's age of instant communication, she was already well known to the world and to all of the church, even though she worked in the midst of great poverty and obscurity for her whole life. The second is that Mother Teresa's work was not just to feed and heal the poor, but to call attention to the scourge and shame of poverty in our world. She devoted her life to solidarity and compassion, and she captured the interest of the world as she did. Now, interestingly, the idea of saints, at least in our tradition, first appears in one of Paul's letters, where he describes saints as people who have gone before us in faith, the cloud of witnesses. And this description is not limited to those whom a church has declared a saint, nor is it limited to our judgment of who is especially good. Instead, for Paul, a saint is anyone who tries to live a life of faith and who has trusted in God through all things. Which is why I earned a new respect for Mother Teresa when I heard a story that I had never heard before about her. I heard it from Ephraim Radner, who is a professor of historical theology at Wycliffe College in Toronto, during a conference this summer in Oxford on the Holy Spirit. Apparently, Mother Teresa was drawn to her vocation by visions of the risen Christ. These visions called her to help the most vulnerable of God's children, and she began this work among the Dalit, the so-called untouchables, India's poorest and most marginalized people. Most of her work was palliative, but inspired by her visions, Mother Teresa not only ministered to people, she founded an order to help her. She received financial help from all over the world to do so. This much of the story I already knew, and perhaps you do too. The part I had not heard before was that only a few years into her more than 50-year vocation, Mother Teresa stopped receiving her visions. We only know this because of letters that she wrote to priests and bishops, which she asked them to burn after reading, but which were preserved, in which she laments her feeling of abandonment by God. For 50 years, in fact, she felt that God was absent from her. In her letters, she often repeated the same cry of dereliction: God does not want me, he is not there. Today, I want to explore what it means to trust in God. What does it mean for the psalmist to say, "Take not thy spirit from me, O Lord"? What do we imagine God is like when we pray these words, "Take not thy spirit from me"? How do they relate to other words of the psalmist, like, "Where can I flee from your presence? If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Even there you guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast"? What are we saying about God when we pray these words? How do we understand God's presence in our lives? So today, as we close this conference on resilience, I want to explore what I'm calling a theology of trust, which I believe is related to, but slightly different than, a theology of hope. And I believe that there is more than just a semantic difference between the two, but I will ask you to decide for yourself. The chief difference between the two, I believe, is that while hope places transformation and God's action in an uncertain future, trust places God's action in a certain present. In our first session, we explored our essential connection to the ground of our being. Yes. I should say, this was actually a gift given to me from my mother on my ordination. And I don't know where she found it, and I don't know what possessed her to get it, but it has hung wherever I study or work since then. Bidden or not bidden, God is present. I think it's fascinating that it's from Carl Jung. In our first session, we explored our essential connection to the ground of our being, and yet how our very human frailty is not something that we can resolve on our own. That we experience our estrangement from God just as a matter of our existence as anxiety and despair. But that we feel and know an essential connection to the ground of our being that cannot be erased. In our second session, we considered how God's revelation in Jesus Christ not only bridges the gap between divine essence and creaturely existence, speaking into the midst of our estrangement, but also shapes the church, the body of Christ, according to the cross. and reminds us that our call is at all times and places one of self-giving transformation. That is not a call to the church, but a call to God first. And today, I want to briefly consider the third and final volume of Tillich's systematic theology, specifically his discussion of what he calls the spiritual presence, the Spirit of God, and the spiritual community, by which he does not mean exactly the church. And I want to start here because this aspect of his theology suggests that God's Spirit is not only present in the church and in its self-giving transformation, but that God's Spirit operates outside of the church as well, and that this has very important implications for how we trust in God. Our experience of the divine within life and history is revealed for us in Jesus the Christ. Christ reveals God's promises of justice and peace, and also reveals that these are what Tillich would call our ultimate concern. That is, these are our created purpose, justice and peace, the highest priority of all life. And our fulfillment of them, God's fulfillment of them, is our ultimate concern. Our continued experience of God's promises is the work of the Spirit. Now, within an ontological theology, God's Spirit is not confined to the actions of Christians or those of the church. If all humanity is created out of being itself, then all humanity is connected to God in the same fundamental way, the same ground of being. So God can be and is manifest wherever and whenever the promises of peace and justice are manifest. In fact, at the end of his career, Tillich began a series of dialogues in Japan that would be published under the title Christianity and the World Religions, in which he states that if he had to do it all over again, he would start with interfaith dialogue as the place where being itself could be more commonly recognized between people of different cultures and different faiths. But don't worry, I'll leave that for mañana. We'll look at it another time. God is revealed immanently within life and history, but God is also transcendent. Thus, God's Spirit is both active within the earthly institution of the church, but also stands outside of the church, beyond the church. And this is actually desirable for us and for the world. If God were too closely identified with a human institution, then ours would be a very small God indeed. Because God is larger than the church, the Spirit both inspires the church and critiques the church. One of the unique challenges for the church, then, is how it can proclaim the gospel's critique of human society to which it belongs, while remaining subject to that same critique and those same principles of justice and peace that it proclaims. For example, the church was a willing partner in the systematic eradication of indigenous cultures and identities, and the church was called to heed the Spirit and apologize to those who had been victimized by residential schools. The church was called to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to live out its recommendations. The frail and faulty church is also subject to the principles it proclaims. The church is an advocate for and seeks to act on behalf of the natural environment, while at the same time seeking to lower its own carbon footprint and be a good steward of hundreds of emptying buildings. For Tillich, the exemplar of this twin responsibility of proclamation and self-critique in the church is the Protestant Reformation. and its tenet, semper reformanda, the church reformed and always reforming. What he calls the Protestant principle is manifest whenever the church seeks its own transformation under the authority of the gospel that it proclaims. So that the church is always both a location of our experience of the transcendent and also a human institution that must be transcended. It both communicates revelation and is accountable to it. In 1859, the French acrobat Charles Blondin announced that he was going to walk across a tightrope suspended across Niagara Falls. Thousands of people gathered to watch. Blondin, a celebrated showman, pushed a bag of cement in a wheelbarrow along the wire, 50 meters above the raging waters. There was a great cheer when he reached the other side. And a reporter who had been watching said to him, "Monsieur Blondin, that was incredible. I believe you could do anything." And without skipping a beat, Blondin pointed to his wheelbarrow and said, "Would you like to get in and see?" They had been led out of Egypt to freedom, but freedom was just another word for nothing left to lose. Israel jumped out of the flesh pots and into the fire of the desert. What now? Moses says, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord." You shall see it. God will provide. And the reason you know that God will provide is that God has just provided. Rest in the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Place your faith in God who continues to do marvelous things because God has done marvelous things. So God provides the morning dew and the daily manna. God provides the word and the face of love itself. God provides the water of change and the Spirit to bless it. The liberation of Exodus, the transformation of Christ, the inspiration of the Spirit, these and more are all witness to the God who provides. In the morning, you shall see the glory of the Lord. For the Hebrew faith, the Exodus is both an historical event and a present reality. God freed the Hebrews from slavery. God frees us from our bondage. For followers of Jesus, this link between the past and present action of God is similar. We don't proclaim that Jesus rose from the dead, past tense, but that Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah. This is the activity of God in the present. Not just then, but now and always. God revealed and anticipated in liberation and transformation. To be grasped by this power is what I am calling trust. When I used to go to my grandmother's house, and I called her Nini, so when I went to my Nini's house, she always made spaghetti and meatballs at least once, every single visit. I loved those meatballs, seasoned just so, simmered all day on the stovetop in that sauce that was so spicy, we used to say, because her taste buds had been shot off in the war. Every visit, without fail, my Nini made spaghetti and meatballs because, as she said, "You're my Papa Bear, and they're your favorite." That's what she called me. I said it, but let me make something very clear. None of you is my Nini, so I don't want to be called Papa Bear today. Every time she made spaghetti and meatballs, so that when we went to visit Nini and Grau, I didn't hope that she would make them. I knew that she would make them. I could trust my Nini in that and much more. See, hope is a longing that we place in the future, something we desire will happen, knowing that it also might not. This makes hope a possibility, the horizon of what we can imagine. And while what we can imagine includes a vague notion that God might act favorably, it also includes the possibility that God will not. Hope implies the possibility of a divine withholding, an absence, a lack of God's action. Trust is a confidence born of experience. Trust maintains that God is present even when we don't have eyes to see and ears to hear, even when the church is in the midst of decline. Trust says, God will provide. In the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord. Trust acknowledges that the ways of God are not our ways. And while this can feel completely unsatisfactory when we are desirous of a particular outcome, if our faith depends on God doing what we want, then it is a very small faith indeed. Now, I will also say that hope for a certain thing to come to pass has a very solid place in the life of faith. For example, I hope that my children will lead happy lives. I hope even that they will know God's presence and love in their lives. Neither of these is certain, but I hope. But I would also note that my hopes are based on my version of what their future should be. I have vague images based on what I can imagine, my version of what constitutes happiness or a life of faith or a life in which God is present. Even my sincerest hopes, in a way, restrict the possibilities of how God might move and shape their lives. If I trust, however, knowing that God has been present in my life in many, many different ways, and in the lives of all those around me in many different ways, ways that I can understand, ways that I can't, ways that I have seen and that I haven't, if I trust that they will know God's love and presence because I know what God has done, and not because of what I have done or what I can envision for them, then I remove the restrictions that my hope places on God's future in their lives. And instead, I adopt a prayerful confidence that God will be with them, even if it's in a way that I can't recognize. Either way, whether I can or can't, I trust that God is with them in the beautiful and the broken times, in love revealed and grief endured, in strength lost and courage regained. I hope that my children don't experience tragedy, but I trust that God will be with them in its midst. I should also say that our prayers of hope are deeply scriptural. When we look at the Psalms, for instance, we see petitions for God to act, to save, to spare. However, these petitions are also always accompanied by at least two other moments of prayer that I think help us to flesh out what we mean by trust. The first, as we've looked at so far, is memory. Our trust in God is rooted in remembering those instances in which God has already acted and saved and spared. Think of our communion prayers and how we recall the story of salvation that brings us to that present moment of God's revelation again in the midst of our community and its worship. The first is memory. The second is lament. That cry of brokenness, of need, of sadness, pain, anger, frustration, grief. Lament is not merely a complaint or an accusation, though God can bear these things too. It's also a recognition of the fact that things are the way they are not the way they should be, because it is not what God has envisioned or promised. In fact, there is a small word in Hebrew that often appears between lamentation and petition, the'atah. I was glad I was able to check this with Bill Morrow on Monday. In English, and then, or and yet. The psalmist sings it boldly, for example, in Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Lament. And yet, it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. Memory. Or Psalm 23. I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Lament. And yet, you are with me. Memory. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. And yet, only within this context of memory and lament do we hear the third moment of the psalmist's prayer, petition, the prayer of things hoped for. So this, I believe, is at least part of the difference between hope and trust, that even in the midst of lament, as we remember what God has done, how God has acted and saved and spare, trust is the posture of our prayer. It is, as I suggested yesterday, like an assurance that precedes a confession, the grace that precedes our error and forgiveness, as well as following it. In discussing this with some colleagues, I learned that it's also important to say that trust should not be at the heart of our inaction or our capitulation. Most of our response to experiences of being united with the holy will be to act ourselves, to help. We can no more ignore the pain of others than we can ignore the crying baby. But trusting in God also means accepting that our actions may not have the desired outcome, or may not have their finished outcome in our lifetime. This doesn't stop us from acting, but it places our action in a much larger framework of God's activity and the much longer horizon of salvation. To abide in God, then, to have trust that we live in God's power, also means not to trust in the powers of this world. Even before we see the fulfillment of God's perfect peace and justice, God's love and mercy, God's healing and wholeness, I believe that our trust and living by it means that we are already being shaped by those promises. We are already being conformed, not to ourselves, not to the image we fashion of ourselves or others, nor to the expectations of those whom we serve, but to the ways and promises of God. I want to offer a few vignettes of what I believe trust looks like in our practice of faith. Now, you will have your own memories of God's action and loving presence in your lives that inform your trust in God. And I invite you to share them at our discussion time. For now, from me, these three. Jesus says, the kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground and would sleep and rise night and day. And the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. The first time I met with Father Thorne we had to walk 2 short blocks from the church office at St. George's Anglican Church in Halifax to a coffee shop. So many were the people who wanted to say hello to him, or thank you, or pray for me, or see you at the supper on Saturday, that what should have taken 3 minutes took 15. It was clear. People loved Father Thorne. He wasn't famous, he wasn't renowned, and this was not a cult of personality. He was loved. Now, I knew him from Sunday worship, where I was a member of the church choir. The congregation would speak of his conviction and compassion. The people of the parish knew him because every morning he walked the streets like this, the streets of the housing projects and the disused and derelict spaces of the neighborhood, stopping to talk with people, kneeling to listen to people. He was deliberate and sincere and generous, and he still is. I tried to describe the quality. It's very difficult to do. He seemed to celebrate the sheer existence of the person to whom he was speaking, seeing each person's name with joy. And if he couldn't remember the name, forgive me, can you remind me what your name is? And when the moment was done, he would say, pray for me. And he's just one of those people that when he says it, you know that he actually means it. His inside matches his outside. Every week he walked the parish like this. Despite whatever busyness he had in his week, he took time to break bread with me that week. And over the years, we have continued to do so, separated by years. But that day's conversation helped me to discern my vocation. And I still seek him out. He is and always will be someone whom I trust and love. And getting to know him over the years, I learned more about his frustrations and disappointments and losses and conflicts in the congregation and conflicts within himself. But these were all a piece with the minister. He didn't suppress or sublimate. He also didn't focus on those things. He never broke confidences, but he also never hid from honesty. He wasn't overly pious or precious. What I saw was someone who seemed to find God as easily in the tenement as at the table, on the corner as easily as on the cross. And not because it was the right way to think or the right way to behave, but because of a fundamental conviction that it is this way, that God dwells in the people and places of this world just as surely as God dwells in the Eucharist, that festival where the poor one is king. Later, I would read what Brother Lawrence once wrote about as the practice of the presence of God, the celebration of all parts and people of life in the certain faith that God blesses all of it. So I'm not writing a hagiography here. What I learned from Father Thorne is what I'm calling habituation. Habituation is more than habit, fulfilling the tasks of life, brushing your teeth, working through an orderly routine, keeping a to-do list, or attempting to bring order to our lives by carving out a determined pattern for it, although I still try to do that. As I mean it, to be habituated is to see the kingdom alive now. It is not to wait for moments when the kingdom is revealed to me or to us, but to know that God's kingdom is being revealed to us in the perfect imperfection of all of life's moments and peoples. Habituation, I think, is the prayerful work of having eyes that see and ears that hear. Trusting that the holy is all around us and, in fact, is happening all around us and within us. My aunt, who lost her oldest son, my cousin Adam, almost 20 years ago, always speaks about Adam in the present. She still cries when she speaks about him, but it's because she feels him near. And she speaks about him all the time. My aunt also recently lost her husband, David, my uncle, to cancer. I was walking with her one day, and she was talking about how many people had asked her if she was angry at God. I've always known my aunt to be a woman of faith. And she said, I was, and I still am. Sometimes I say, what the hell do you think you were doing? But God has also been with me my whole life. God was there when I lost my parents, when my sisters and I had to raise each other, and more. She said, I wouldn't know what to do without God in my life. He's always been there. Lament and memory. If I have learned anything from my aunt, it is to trust that the dark of our grief and our loss is not always menacing. That it is in the worst moments that God is with us, listening to our cries. It is then that God's Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. God does not abandon us. God does not hurt us, but draws closer to us and is with us in those moments of loss and grief, and is with us in our release from its captivity. You remember the parable of the sower. Seed is cast onto different soils, fruitful, rocky, thorny, and dry. And it's clear that not every attempt to grow something has an equal chance of working. On the surface, the parable seems to be a fairly matter-of-fact tale about failure. But from experience, I also see it as a parable for ministry. Not every church program takes off. Not every sermon lands. Not every strategic plan really guides us to where we feel we should be going. But I don't think the parable is actually about success and failure. Because in its interpretation by Jesus, Mark moves so swiftly from metaphor to interpretation, kind of cashing out what each of the soils means, we can be forgiven for skipping right over what I think is the first and most obvious question, which is, why would anyone, least of all an experienced sower, throw seed on rocky ground? Why? The parable doesn't seem to make sense if we're just cashing it out. If it likely won't take root, why waste good seed on thorny brush? And yet we are told, the sower keeps on sowing. Soil, rock, thorn. The sower keeps on sowing. In 2016, researchers at Stanford University canvassed the homes of 500 voters, not in California, but in South Florida. A new bill was being debated that would increase the rights of transgendered people and their protection in public. And there was clear and widespread opposition to this bill. So the researching canvassers simply went door to door asking people they visited how they would vote, and then to put themselves in the shoes of someone who might be protected by this bill. Two very simple questions. In one instance, Apparently, a female canvasser encountered a socially conservative man who used a particular slur to indicate that he was not intending to support the bill. Her response, which was incredibly brave, was to share that she was gay and that she felt that the bill was more about taking care of one another than it was about any special interest. And when the man heard the words taking care of each other, apparently, according to her, he softened a bit. He shared that his wife was disabled and that he understood what it meant to help others, to care for one another. That language reached something in him. The study cited many similar sample conversations and found that not only did voters' anti-trans attitudes diminish when they returned 3 months later, but they remained when the bill was voted on. It wasn't just a momentary softening. There was something that planted in them. Now, unfortunately, the bill was defeated. But can we say that the canvassers actually failed? The sower keeps on sowing. The Dalai Lama once famously said that everything we do has an impact on the world. It may take 500 years before that impact is known, but everything we do has an impact. And again, I say that such a long horizon may be of little comfort when you're stacking the chairs and turning out the lights in the church hall to head home late at night. It doesn't necessarily help when you're sitting wordless at the bedside of someone suffering in their last hours. And it's cold comfort indeed when the person next to you on the plane is, without you having asked, sharing their story as to why they left the church. But everything we do in the service of God has an impact, because it is not we alone who are doing it. The sower keeps on sowing. When I left pastoral ministry, we were in the midst of COVID, so there was little in the way of celebration or send-off. To be honest, I was already 3 months into my faculty position, so I was a little bit too busy to be disappointed. And the congregation did everything that protocols would allow. Among other things, I received a box of notes and letters gathered from over 100 people in the congregation, addressed to me, and many more addressed to my family, actually. We took a few hours on a quiet Sunday afternoon to read through all of them. And there was one that stood out for me from one of the graduating teens. I want to share a short passage with you. And I hope that you will hear in these words someone that you have known in your ministry or in your teaching, in your time helping the sower sow. The person wrote, "As much as you have taught me, you have also listened. You have never said no for fear of things falling apart when left to a young person. You gave me a shot at the ideas I had, no matter what. Thank you for being open-minded. Thank you for making me think a little harder, reflect a little deeper. Thank you for trusting me. My faith has blossomed so much." The sower keeps on sowing. It's hard to see the impact that we have when we're in the midst of life. Even harder when we fall prey to comparing our insides with other people's outsides. Even harder when we witness the decline of this church that we cherish and that we have worked so hard to help. Hard when our anxiety and our concerns overwhelm us. Hard when our family's needs conflict with the congregation's. Hard when we feel like we've become a subcontractor for the funeral home. Hard when we have nothing left to do but close the doors. But please, trust that you have shared God's love with God's people. Trust that what you do and have done has an impact. Trust that the sower is sowing, that God is working within you and within others to draw all creation ever closer to the good. I place my trust in God because of memory. I remember from my years singing in the chapel at King's College in Halifax that each week we would pray together. We said yesterday, we have done those things which we ought not to have done, and we have left undone those things which we ought to have done. A confession, a universal truth that we can say every day. But in our tradition, as you know, confession is not an act that stands alone. It is always followed by an invitation to receive God's grace again. And so, in worship, having prayed, to break bread and sing and give thanks for what God has done and is doing. And there in that chapel, even in the midst of my imperfection and failures and anxieties and disappointments, even in the soils of which I was not proud, the rocky and the thorny and the parched places in my life, God, I believe, sowed promise by assuring me that I was not alone, that I was loved. The sower keeps on sowing. Many years later, I remember that during my time with what was then called the Aboriginal Working Group of the Maritime Conference, I learned from teaching elders about settler Canada's reluctance to live into peace and friendship treaties signed between sovereign nations. But my experience was that those elders did not speak with anger toward me or even toward my church. Rather, they spoke with grace. I was invited time and again into a relationship of trust, a circle of trust. And I was hesitant. I was new. I made mistakes. And yet over and over again, the invitation came to be a part of the circle. I was invited to share responsibility for what we do now together, invited into the work of humility, invited into the work of listening and honoring, invited into the work of addressing systemic racism in our churches and nation, invited into the work of healing through deepening relationship with all creation. I was invited not into passivity or into guilt, nor to a speedy resolution. I was invited to listen and to be honest. The sower keeps on sowing. Such is my testimony. Even as we confess and name our brokenness, God lavishes upon us and all creation the love that roots our healing and transformation, the seeds of hope planted in all of the soils. As Episcopal author Tricia Gates Brown says, if we actually encounter who we are by falling into divine mercy and embrace, then we can stop trying so hard to be right and pure. When we fail and fall, it is not the end, it is the beginning. The sower keeps on sowing. And finally, I remember where we began our time together. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. Thank you.
So again, I think we're at the point where we want to invite some comment, question, and conversation. And once again, I will say what I've been saying every time, and that is that Ellen is here with the mic in the room, and we'd be delighted to have your comments here, and we will intersperse those with comments from the 15 people who are online, and kind of try to go back and forth here. So hoping that you've had a really good rest overnight and that you're brimming with questions today. This is your last kick at the can. I'm just moving my camera around so I can see. Here we go. We've got one.
I'm going to try and pick up several threads from both your previous talks as well as Tracy's conversations. All of us as people who love Jesus and are in the service of the church have experienced stressors beyond what we ever imagined was possible. I actually remember at the beginning of the pandemic complaining to John Young, that he never taught me how to deal with a pandemic. And he wisely said, no, but I did teach you how to reflect theologically on trauma. Yeah. And that has been my struggle for the past 2.5 years. I'm also recalling that Tracy talked about self-care happening in community. I don't know what that looks like. We're not all having baths together. I'm drawing the line right there. And I heard you talking about the need for honest self-awareness and confession in order to continue in this life where we actually do believe that the sower is sowing seeds on the soils of our life. My reflection is that it's really hard. And it's really hard, particularly in light of what I'm experiencing as the structure of the church that actually supports increasing fragmentation between ministry personnel and particularly between rural and urban ministry personnel. An increasing sense of isolation because there's fewer of us, right? And an increasing lack of support from the structures of the church for all of us who are in ministry at this time. And so I just want to hear what you see as the good seeds being sowed in this soil.
That's an excellent question, Lynn. Thank you. Maybe I'll start with just a personal example or story. I was privileged to have a mentor come into my life close to the beginning of my ministry. And he was very interested in exactly this question long before COVID, long before the structural change of the church. And his response was actually then, I was mentioning it to Todd yesterday and to the group that was gathered in the afternoon. His response was to put together a small group. And he was running an experiment. And he was doing it outside of the structures of the church, actually, for the reason that he wanted some freedom to be able to bring the people together that at least in his and other people's consultants and estimation could be helpful to each other and might actually sprout some of the seeds. I was unbelievably fortunate to be gathered with that group. It lasted for about 2 years. We had check-ins. We had 3 times together drawn from all across Canada and all the different corners of our church. there were a number of things that happened in that group, and I can't explain exactly how. That would be the kind of work that I think Todd was trying to help us and Bill were trying to help us understand yesterday. Peer group, small group work. But I know that there were a couple of things that came out of it, seeds that were planted, at least for me early in my ministry, and I'll come to your question in 2 seconds. One was a dissolving of the ego, that in 2 respects. One is that my work is not my work. It's God's, it's the church's, it's our work. I do what I can. I can do no more. I can also do no other. And then the second is that one of the questions I remember him asking me was, what do you want? Like, what is it you seek? And that question has stayed with me or plagued me ever since, because it forces me to reflect on what I think God is actually doing or calling me to do. Is God calling me, for example, in my first pastoral charge, is God calling me to stay there as they close and to try and prop it up, to do everything I can to try and make sure that it stays alive? Or is God calling me elsewise? I couldn't know that answer in advance. When I left, the church is closed. But what they had left, they opened a wellness center in the manse. It survived for 3 years. Can I say that they failed? Can I say that we gave up? Can I say that God wasn't there? No, because something happened for that time, for those people that needed to happen. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, what I learned from being a part of that small group was, I need to find my people. And my people, finding them will not always be accomplished by the structures of the church. It just can't happen. I was talking to Michael Blair a few days ago, just at these meetings that I was at. The sheer number of tasks that he and General Council Executive have, the sheer amount of work that needs to be done by our church, it's not possible. They do their best. They're faithfully working in God's name. Brené Brown, this is the last thing I'll say, has this image of a candle, like a tea light, this very small light, and it represents our lives. Each one of us has one of these, right? And she says there are people in your lives who will surround that flame to protect it, and there are people who will try to blow it out. There are things that you commit yourself to that will protect that flame, and there are things that you commit yourself to that will try to blow it out. And she said, you just always need to be aware of who those people are and what those commitments are that will keep your flame glowing. I think it's a humbling image. It's also one that says, that involves me in my own practice of tending to that flame. And that says, I must find my people. And those have been different people at different times in my life. I'm sure it has been for you as well. And there are some who remain and some who move on. But we know them when we know them. And I think that's all we can do, honestly. Yeah. I don't know if that helps you, but those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you. That certainly helps me.
Okay.
I don't see any questions online here. Is there anyone in the room, Alan, that you're looking at?
While people are filling that, we have a question.
Just behind you there, Bill.
Right there.
Thank you, Andy, for some very stimulating lectures. I wonder if you could draw a few lines following the last questioner between your remarks and what we heard from Tracy yesterday. If I understand her correctly, when she talks about moral injury, one of the moral injuries that occurs is, in fact, a lack of trust, a collapse in the capacity to trust. You've been highlighting the necessity of engaging in trust. How do we address, either corporately or individually, the fact that we may be injured to the point of not being able to trust?
It's an excellent question. I can't speak for Tracy or for her work. I understand what you're doing. You're just asking me to sort of reflect on that. What I heard her saying was one of the things I took away from yesterday was the absolute necessity of naming and articulating when those moral injuries have happened. That the more frequently we ignore it or don't pay attention to it as individuals, but also within community. I think that was another point she was making, that self-care is in community. Then the more damage we do to ourselves and to others, the ripple effects continue. If I could draw a connection to what I have been talking about, it would be that if as a church, our perseverance becomes toughing it out, pushing through, propping up, failing to recognize what's happening, holding a vision that is ours of what the church was and must continue to be, then we will do injury to ourselves. And we are doing injury to ourselves. The rate of minister burnout right now is insane. It's not possible for us to keep the vision of the church that we have had going into the future. We simply must make changes. And I think what I have tried to do is to do two things. One is to name that, to say that that is what we are called to do as people of faith, and to say that God is with us in that. And in fact, they rely on each other. Our critique of the church and our critique of the way we do things now has to be based in our trust in God, that God is the one, God's Spirit is the one who is inspiring that critique and that reframing, that reformation of what the church is and will be. And I have to do that with trust because I don't know. It's like that Sehnsucht. I long for, I don't know what, right? But I long for God to lead me there, both in my own life and in the life of the church. That's what I could offer at this point, Bill. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And we actually have Tracy on the line this morning.
Oh, great.
So she's interested in adding to what you have to say. So
Excellent.
Tracy, turn on your camera and your mic and let's bring you up.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I think that, Andy, you addressed this wonderfully, but of course, I can't resist adding a few words because I've been quite transfixed by the conversation and your presentation this morning and last night. Again, the whole Bill's question is so important. Trust is eroded indeed by experiences of moral injury and our moral harms. And it will be eroded increasingly, just exponentially more and more, if we fail to address moral distress and debrief about it. So first of all, again, we need to normalize moral distress and moral injury. We need to talk about it. We need it to be discussed in worship. We must have that. People need to be not only knowledgeable about this phenomena of moral distress and what it means and how it happens and how they're experiencing it in their own lives, but also to know that their faith community understands it, has a name for it, and is not only willing, but passionate to talk about it and to provide space that won't be perfectly safe, but that will be a beginning space to start putting words on those experiences, to start drawing connections between our experiences of moral injury and our spiritual lives. So, how does this affect, again, our spiritual needs? And one of those spiritual needs, as Bill so well put it, is trust, and that need to experience self-worth and belonging in community. And when that is damaged by having our core values, by having us acting against our core values, again, I can't help but underscore repeatedly the sense of isolation and shame that happens, and I'm talking unconstructive shame that happens when we experience moral injury and we just isolate ourselves, and our voice seems to be lost, and our sense of who we are and our meaning and direction crumbles. That the only real way that I know of to be able to work with that constructively is to talk about it with God, ourselves, and our community. And so we need that permission. I think the only way that I can imagine getting that permission is to have, again, it normalized through worship, especially, perhaps small groups in addition. It's just such an isolating, fracturing experience that does indeed erode our trust, not just in others, but in ourselves and then in God too. So thank you for that question. And thank you very much for your presentation, Andy. Appreciate it so very much.
Thanks.
Did you want to carry on, Andy? I've got John Buttars ready to come up next, but I thought I'd give you a chance to respond to Tracy if you like.
No, I think she said, I really appreciate what she had to say. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So John, over to you. If you can turn your camera and mic on, please.
So I'm feeling a bit odd about speaking. I mean, I'm retired, and my next birthday, I'm turning 80. So I'm the old guy moving out. But I would like to add to this business of trust, and to trust your ability to hear your own groans and sighs. So I'll give two examples of that. I have had spiritual directors since 1977, not the same one. And when I retired, I continued that practice. And I've had a number since. They were first of all Roman Catholic, but then I began to realize all you need is to find somebody you trust. That's all. And then to try to speak to the heart. My most recent example of that is somebody asked me, John, have you ever thought of walking the Camino? And I said, no. And I heard the strength of my response, and I realized I have absolutely no interest in walking the Camino, but I have an interest in walking the Bruce Trail. So I wrote an email in 2017 and simply sent it out to a bunch of people that I thought I would enjoy walking with it. And lo and behold, 2 people responded. And it's now 2022, but next spring, I'm going to finish walking the Bruce Trail if I'm still healthy. So I think we have to learn how to trust our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own intuitions, and then to act upon them. And if they don't work out, they don't work out. Mm-hmm. It's not a failure. It's just an experience to learn from. So a number of you have commented on the significance of trust. Trusting self, trusting others, trusting God's good earth, trusting God.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. What it makes me think is one of the challenges that we face is discerning when that voice of instinct is the voice of inner authority that God has given us, and when it is one of those mental tapes that has been placed there by others or by harmful experiences. That's one of the real challenges. Another mental tape that can be placed there is, as we were talking about in the first session, this drive for perfection, always, good, better, best, getting bigger, numbers in the pews, is how we have for so long determined whether a church is growing or declining. And I think it's possible, just as an example, for a congregation to be declining in numbers. I know it's possible because I've seen it, to be declining in numbers and yet be absolutely filled with God, with God's Spirit, becoming a neighboring church, doing something different, trying, experimenting. Both things can be true. So I would just want to emphasize that the kind of trust, the theology, I call it a theology of trust because it is explicitly trust in God. And we can hear God speak through that inner voice, of the inner authority that God has given us. Absolutely. But that's where the work of self-care and community comes in, because it is in prayerful reflection with others, I think, that we begin to discern the difference between when God's inner voice of authority that God has given us is the voice that's speaking, and when it might be one of those tapes playing, because the tapes can be harmful. But thank you for your comments, John. I really appreciate your reflection.
Thanks, Andy. Is there anybody in the room who would like to speak? Andy, it's more just a thank you. In that, well, you know, I finished my master's at AST in 2018, and I gained hope that you're offering a course coming up on this very topic. I lament that we didn't have an opportunity to engage in this learning at my time at AST, but I hold out hope that it will become a part of the regular opportunity for future students to take, because I'm invigorated. I have hope, and I hold hope in the fact that the sower is constantly sowing. So I applaud you for seeing this through, and look for me to take a continuing ed. I'm going to keep my eye open on AST's website.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you.
So we have Joy on the line. If you don't want to carry on with that, Joy.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
This is a question to you, Andy, but also maybe to everyone. I was just thinking about the theme for this whole event on resilience. And so the geek in me went to etymology online and looked up the word resilience, and it means to bounce back. And for me, like, I don't know if that's quite where I feel like I am, or where my congregations will be. Like, I don't think we're going to go back to something that we were before. So I guess I was just wondering about if there was another word that would better help us hold a vision of where we are and where we're beginning to go. Like, even if we don't know what the final end result will be, I wondered if there was another word. And I don't know, the one that I chose is release. I didn't want that to sound like we're just letting everything go, but maybe it is about letting go of things that don't matter, especially if we don't have the volunteers or the energy to be doing it all anymore, just paring it down to what's essential. But I wanted to hear from others if you had other words of maybe how we can approach this time in ministry.
So I would love to open it up to the floor. I just want to respond with two quick things. One is, you remember I mentioned Paul Hutchinson at the Coromilla Peace Initiative in Northern Ireland. He doesn't work there anymore, but he did for 30 years. And his notion was that peace very much included, and by peace, of course, he means, you know, not just accord, but a sort of relationship, right? That peace is remember and change. I think it's really important when we talk about resilience to say that bouncing back is bouncing back to something that's different than it was, right? In the first session I was mentioning, and I can forgive anybody for having glossed over this, but that social construction of self-consciousness is not just some sort of artifact of 19th century German philosophy. It is that in every interaction I have, and I would add through every experience I have, I become slightly different than I was before. And so resilience, I think, is not just bouncing back like to some original state, because that's a falsehood. We're constantly changing through time. Rather, resilience is returning maybe to something that looks, initially looks a little bit like it did before, but acknowledging, incorporating the experiences we've had and the changes through which we've gone. That we are now, maybe not fundamentally different, but we are very different than we were, just to Lynn's point, for example, than we were 2.5 years ago. So I really appreciate that question, because I think we do a detriment to ourselves and to others when we say we're going to return to normal, or we're going to bounce back from COVID. That it's a slow return to what we were doing before. I think we do a disservice. And now I would love to hear what other words people have, because I can't think of an alternative right off the top of my head. But maybe I've given you some time if someone has an idea.
Words are important, aren't they? And they're hard to find.
Well, for example, so I will add, since no hands are firing up, it's why I have continued to use the word transformation as opposed to change. Change is just what happens. Transformation is purposeful. It's referential. It occurs with reference to something. That's why I've used the word trust instead of hope, because I'm not just looking for whatever's coming next or what might be new or what I can imagine, but trusting that the transformation we're going through also has a purpose, but has a purpose in God. So I do agree that I think resilience can be misleading, but I think if we incorporate, as we've tried to do during this conference, some of the other words that we mean when we say resilience. So that's why we need to preach about resilience, so we have the time to be able to flesh it out for people, right?
Andy, over here.
Todd.
Yesterday you talked about that two things can be true. And so, and yesterday I mentioned about people saying tired. So I'm wondering what, when we talk about trust and God sowing seeds, I'm wondering if you can imagine what is being planted in that experience of being tired.
Mm-hmm. A question. And well, I could just refer back to my mentor's question, which is, what do you want? Do you want to keep pushing? Well, there's a fundamental question when you're tired. Should I just continue doing this or not? Should I change the way I'm approaching this? So reassessing. Should I reframe my understanding of what I'm doing, what its purpose is? I think maybe what's being planted when we are tired, I think there's always something being planted. When we're tired, our bodies are being invited to rest. Our minds are being invited to healing. Our hearts are as well. We're being invited not to try and do it alone. We're being invited to depend on others. As people who serve, it's very easy for us to get into that habit of being the ones who serve, and harder to welcome the healing and the service of others, right? It's harder to do that. So perhaps, at least on my initial thoughts would be, when we're tired, we're being asked to ask some of those questions. What is God signaling to me in my fatigue? And I'll say on a practical level, I laugh because this happens so frequently during COVID. Jenny found this checklist of sort of wellness, like a self-evaluation that you can do when you're angry, tired, frustrated, cranky, all those kinds of things. And it was, have you slept? Have you had a glass of water? Have you eaten? Like, it's these very fundamental things. And then the idea being that once you've done all of those things, then you're actually able to ask the question, okay, why do I feel that way? But if you ask that question when you're tired or hungry or thirsty or in the midst of a conflict, it's impossible. I think we were coming to that yesterday too with your question. So I think at the very heart of it, the seed that's being planted is go and do those things and then come back and ask some of those reframing questions. Yeah.
So just to pick up on Joy's question, and then I've got another comment from Daryl Woods online. But Bill, I don't have a word, Joy, but I've got a paragraph. Bill Morrow and I were talking yesterday about the lectures that he gave a couple of years ago. And I was saying that the notion of God as creator is something that has become really important to me. And the sense of salvation as creation. That God as creator didn't set the clock ticking at the beginning of time and let it run forever. That salvation is an act of creation. And that every moment of salvation, it's a sort of second Isaiah version of salvation. But that salvation is always a new act of creation rather than a restoration of the old. So for me, it's that kind of salvation rather than just resilience that I long for and trust in. So there's my word for you, and it's not a word; it's a paragraph, Joy. But
could I just add one thing to that?
Please do. Go ahead.
That in the Christian tradition, we read that when Jesus rises, he is different, he is changed, and yet the wounds are visible. It's why I always find kintsugi such an interesting image, that very definitely he is not the same and yet is the same, right?
It's different from the resuscitation of Lazarus.
Exactly. So he is changed, he is transformed.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Daryl has asked me to read his question to you because he's been listening to us while he's working out on the treadmill. And he would rather not, he says, share all his sweaty glory. So the rest of us are jealous, Daryl, but we're glad that you're with us. And he's wondering if you could connect some dots between what you've shared today and some of the work you've done with Edge.
Oh, yeah. Well, sure. I tried to give a couple of examples, but I would say that it's a great question. And Daryl, thank you for multitasking and looking after your body while you've been looking after your mind. The hardest concept for the congregations I have worked with, at least I can't speak for other coaches, but the hardest concept to come to is this idea that two things are happening at the same time, that there is decline, and very often it is decline as change in the church. And that's true for congregations, but also that within that, let me put it this way. God does not call us into a future for which God is not already preparing us. That soil is not actually soil of decline. It's that one plant, one fruit of that soil has lived its life. And now something else is ready to be born, ready to emerge. And so the hardest thing for congregations often in edge work to sort of come to terms with is that what they have known and what they have done, or at least the way they have done it, may have to alter, but it doesn't mean that their ministry has no value, that what they have done has had no value. All of it is honored in the transformation because that is part of how God has brought them to that moment in time. And so I would say that the work then of all congregations, with Edge consultants or not, is to always be asking those questions. What is God calling us into now? I mean, I remember that at least, well, I won't name it, but one of the churches I've been a part of, I think the last time they had, there was something like 10 or 15 years in between strategic conversations. And I just thought like, well, But even when you're in the midst of everything flourishing, that's the moment to be having that conversation as well. Not when you're sort of wondering what you should be doing. Because then, anyway, I won't get into Otto Scharmer, but the whole point is God is working to bring something out of every moment. And so the work of Edge with churches is to inquire as to what that is in that time and season.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, but I'd love to take another question from the room if there's somebody here who would like to.
Right here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right next to you. Yeah.
Let me just move my camera here to my, hang on, where is it? My partner in crime here who has been just made my life so much easier. There she is.
Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Going back to Joy's point, the word that comes to mind is liminal. And I love that word because it's so full of possibility. It just is like rich with, you have no idea where you're going, but it's all ahead of you. And the other thing that I was thinking of with Todd's question is senesting, and how when you are in a liminal space, it is exhausting because you're rebuilding yourself, right? You're rebuilding your life. And so you need that time to senesce in order to bloom into something different. You've kind of addressed it already, but as somebody new to ministry, it's really, really frightening for a lot of us to come into a church that is going through such change, transformation, and to know that we are leaders within this to kind of help people get to the next part. In change management, we call this the messy middle. And I totally feel like, a big hot mess when I'm when I'm moving forward. Is there any advice you can give us newbies as to, aside from discernment and prayer and I guess consulting with other people like Edge, what we can do to help not just ourselves move forward, but our congregations move forward, which tend to be tired and older and smaller.
It's just a great question, Michelle. Thank you. I want to add one image to your sort of going back to Todd's question, which is, as a singer, I know that when I know the music, even if I've only run through it one or two times, it's easy to sing. When I'm sight singing, it's absolutely exhausting. The first rehearsal with music is always exhausting. That doesn't mean it's not good. It just means that it's really tiring because you're doing something new. And so I just wanted to highlight that as another image of what that's like. If I could stick with the music image for the second part of your question, I also just recently, like in the past 3 years, started learning the drums. Now, I always tapped and beat and played on everything around me. And I think I just discovered that it's actually my instrument. Everyone has an instrument, and I've played lots and I've sung, but I finally found my instrument. But I found something else, which was as a singer and as someone who would regularly do solos, I was performing. I was focused on my performance and my voice. And nobody comes, well, rarely do they come just to hear the drums, right? They come to hear a band. And so there was a change after 40 years of doing music in my experience and understanding of doing music, which was, it's not about me. I can't believe it took me that long, but because I've sung in choirs my whole life, but it's not about me. And in fact, what happened was I discovered a whole new joy in playing with others that even hadn't been there in choir, because my drumming is easier when the bass and I are in sync, and the music sounds better when we're in sync and when we can hear that, all of that. Those of you who do music, there's a different level of joy and synchronicity that happens when you're working together. I say that because I think it's The very first thing that I had to learn in ministry is that the trusting relationship with your congregation takes time. Depending on the size of the church, it could be a couple of years, it could be 7 or 8. There are ministers, when they've had long ministries, can look back and say, actually, it wasn't until year 5 that we really hit our stride. And I think that can be because of circumstance, sure, but it can also be because of that trusting relationship. My mentor says when he runs sort of gatherings of peers and retreats, he says it takes 3 days for people to finally exhale. So actually, he insists that retreats be 5 days at least because of that. And I think that's true of our relationship with congregations as well. It takes them a little while to exhale, even more so now, as you know, some ministers are moving every sort of 3 or 4 years. That's one thing. The other thing is not just consulting with Edge, but as I said before with Todd, finding your people. I know from observing the summer distance students at AST that actually that online community is absolutely essential. It keeps you in touch. You could say a lot more about it than I could, but that's where you ask questions. It's where you express frustrations, and I don't see those, which is probably good because I'm on faculty, but I know that's where you are talking to each other and working out the things that you are concerned about and happy about, joyful about. That has to somehow continue into ministry, because as soon as you get bogged down by, and you will get bogged down by that work of being now the ordained, the paid accountable person in the church who is supposed to lead. As Tracy has said, and as I have tried to say in different ways, if you're not talking to people about what you're experiencing, then you will only just get more and more tired. But I'll say one last thing, which is I find a lot of the times my work in theology and in ministry is just a slight reframing. Hope to trust as an example. One of those within the church is that for a long time, I was referring to the death spasms of the church. So like, this grasping after what we used to be, and a sort of a nostalgia and a longing for what used to be. And I saw it as like, well, the last moments before it's all over. It took a number of years. One of the things I've started doing, though, is referring to the birth pangs of the church. And that sounds strange because we've been around for a long time and the church has been around for even longer. Faith has been around even longer. But in fact, I think some of those struggles, if I reframe it slightly and say, these are the birth pangs of what God is bringing into evidence, what God is manifesting among us, then as I say, it doesn't help when we're turning out the lights after a long meeting, but it does help, I hope, in the long run of saying, okay, now I understand why I'm doing this. And then with all of the things we've been talking about, self-reflection, time for rest, asking questions, all of those things hopefully are part of my answer to what you're saying. Yeah, thank you.
Looking to my comments, questions, colleagues in the planning committee here, we hit 10:30. I think that's our stopping time, isn't it? So John, are you, let's bring up John Young.
Andy, it's sometimes hard to know just how to say thank you after 3 really thought-provoking, stimulating addresses. So others have spoken to the first 2, so I'll do a bit of reflection about this one, simply to say, thank you for encouraging us again to engage theologically with the concept of trust. For someone of my age, who still struggles with modernity and the certainty and self-sufficiency, that's just part of the ambiance in which I grew up, even as I know we've moved beyond it. Trust and thinking about trust is something I'm going away from this with, and thank you for that. Thank you more broadly for being willing to come among us here, but also among those who have gathered virtually, and to scatter some seeds. And as you know, how those grow, we don't know, but you have done the scattering. So thank you.
Thank
and
you,
God
John.
bless.
Thank you. I just, oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry. Thank you so much for everyone's time and attention, and especially to those online, because I know how hard it can be to sort of feel involved when you're at a distance. And thank you to the planning committee. This has been a really, really well-run and thoughtful and also friendly event, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for this and for your time and attention, and God be with you. Thank you.
So we're just going to take about a minute or two here to get set up for our closing worship service. And I'd invite those who are leading that service to come forward now as we get things ready, and we'll pull up that PowerPoint and move into the final moments of our time together today. Sorry, I've got to get ready for the. This is your PowerPoint, is that right? Good show. Okay, let me pull zoom back over here. And is Michelle, are you involved in this, or can you move PowerPoints? Perfect. Okay. Let me bring the PowerPoint small enough that.